The loader tractor was already pushing the first pile of orange hulls when Nora Vance pulled her old blue Chevrolet truck into the gravel lot of the Route 121 farm market. It was the last Tuesday of October. The cold in Calloway County had moved in fast 3 nights earlier, turning the soft clay mud along the drainage ditches into gray ridges that cracked under her work boots as she stepped out of the cab. The market manager, a man named Vernon Boyd, who had been running the regional farm stand for 16 years, stood near the back loading dock with his hands buried deep in the pockets of his canvas coat. He was watching the loader work with the settled expression of a man who was glad to see a problem being moved out of his sight. The problem was 600 pumpkins. They had been clean, bright carving stock 3 weeks ago, stacked high for the autumn school groups and suburban families driving out from the city. But the season had ended early. A hard frost in mid-October had sent the tourists home. The school trips had been canceled. And now 600 pumpkins had sat in the open field, lot long enough for the weather to work its way inside. They were cracked, most of them, soft in the places where the outer skin had given up under the frost, and thawed into pulp. A thick gray-green mold had taken hold around the stems, spreading in damp patches across the ribbed sides. A few had collapsed completely under their own weight, leaking a dull yellow fluid onto the gravel. Vernon Boyd was paying the regional waste hauler $40 to bring a drop-box dumpster in the morning, to haul the entire batch to the county landfill. Nora Vance walked past the loader and stopped at the edge of the pile. She stood with her feet planted slightly wide, her weight shifted slightly to her left side, a habit she had picked up over 4 years of walking on a right knee that contained 3 pieces of shrapnel from a mortar shell near Fallujah. She wore a faded, canvas field jacket, her brown hair pulled back tight into a knot at the base of her neck, and a gray neoprene brace wrapped snugly around her right wrist to support a hand that had lost half its grip strength. She did not look angry, nor did she look hurried. She looked at the 600 moldy pumpkins with the quiet, narrow focus of a logistics officer, calculating weight, tonnage, and utility. Vernon Boyd noticed her standing there in the cold wind and walked over, his breath rising in small white clouds. He said, "We're clearing out the lot, Nora. End of the run." Nora did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on the pile. She said, "I can see that." Vernon looked at her sideways. Everyone along Route 121 knew Nora Vance. They knew her as Thomas Vance's granddaughter, the woman who had come back from the army 4 years ago with a stiff leg, a quiet voice, and a determination to run her late grandfather's 75-acre sheep farm on Oak Ridge alone. People in Calloway County respected her service in the abstract, but behind closed doors at the feed store, they considered a 34-year-old disabled veteran running 52 head of Katahdin sheep on thin limestone soil to be a slow recipe for bankruptcy. Vernon gestured toward the loader. "You need a pumpkin for your porch, Nora? Take 2. They're going in the dump anyway." Nora said, "I need all 600 of them." Vernon stopped. He looked at the tractor, then at the mountain of rotting, soft-spotted fruit, and then back at Nora's face. Her face showed no sign of a joke. He said, "Nora, these things are done for. Half of them are soup inside. The mold has taken the stems." Nora reached into her pocket, pulled out a small leather coin purse, and unzipped it with her good left hand. She said, "What will you take to let me load them into my bed right now, instead of paying $40 to the hauler?" Vernon Boyd stared at her. To him, simple arithmetic was simple arithmetic. If he took $20 from Nora, he was $60 ahead of where he had been 5 minutes ago. He shrugged, pulled his hands out of his jacket, and spat on the gravel. He said, $20. But you haul every single one of them today. I want this lot clear by dark." Nora handed him a folded $20 bill. She said, "Deal." Near the front office, 2 men were standing by the tailgate of a heavy Julie pickup truck, waiting for their feed orders. One of them was Hank Miller, a wealthy cattle farmer, who owned 400 acres of prime bottomland along the creek and ran 200 head of commercial Angus cattle, using industrial grain rations and heavy machinery. Hank looked over at Nora, watched her lower her truck's tailgate, and let out a short, barked laugh that carried clearly across the quiet parking lot. Hank called out, his voice laced with heavy sarcasm, "What are you going to do with 600 rotten pumpkins, Nora? Open up a pie shop for the crows on Oak Ridge?" The other farmer chucked, shaking his head. Nora Vance did not look up. She did not answer. She walked to the edge of the pile, reached down with her left hand, scooped up a 30-pound soft pumpkin by its solid base, and tossed it into the bed of her Chevrolet. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. She worked for 3 straight hours in the freezing wind, loading the rotted weight of 600 pumpkins one by one, her stiff knee clicking with every turn, her brace holding her weak wrist firm against the weight. The blue Chevrolet truck groaned under the weight as Nora turned off Route 121 and began the steep, winding 3-mile climb up Oak Ridge Road. The rear springs were compressed nearly flat against the rubber bumpers, the right rear tire rubbing faintly against the wheel, whenever the truck hit a dip in the asphalt. She kept her speed at 25 miles per hour, holding the wheel firmly with her left hand, while her braced right hand rested on her thigh, throbbing with a low, familiar ache that always accompanied the arrival of frost. The Vance property sat on 75 acres of high, dry ridge ground near the border of Calloway County. It was land that most modern commercial farmers looked down upon. The topsoil was thin, rarely extending more than 4 inches before striking the hard, impenetrable shelf of white limestone that formed the backbone of the ridge. Her grandfather, Thomas Vance, had bought the parcel in 1961. After returning from a tour in Korea, he had cleared the cedar thickets by hand, built a sturdy timber frame barn out of rough-sawn white oak, and raised a small herd of dual-purpose sheep for 35 years until his heart gave out on a cold morning in 2020. Nora had been in a military field hospital in Germany when her grandfather passed. She was 30 years old then, lying in a narrow bed with 3 surgical incisions in her right leg and a wrist that had been shattered when a supply vehicle hit a roadside charge on the dusty outskirts of Fallujah. She had taken the phone call from her aunt while sitting on the edge of her cot, listening to the static on the line, looking down at her bandaged foot, and realizing that the life she had planned in the Military Logistics Corps was over. When the Army discharged her 16 months later, with a permanent mobility rating and a monthly disability check, she did not look for a desk job in the city. She bought a one-way ticket back to Kentucky, walked into her grandfather's cold house, and took over the 75 acres. The first 2 years on Oak Ridge had been an exercise in brutal reality. Running a sheep farm alone with a damaged body was vastly different from watching her grandfather do it during summer visits as a teenager. The fencing was down in 4 places. The pastures had been overtaken by invasive thistles and scrub oak. The feed store bills accumulated with frightening speed. But Nora possessed the 2 traits her grandfather had valued above all else: an absolute refusal to panic, and a habit of calculating systems until she found the leverage hidden within them. She backed the truck slowly up to the wide sliding door of the oak barn at 6:45 p.m. The light had faded from the autumn sky, leaving a narrow stripe of burnt orange along the western horizon. Inside the barn, the low, soft bleating of 52 Katahdin sheep drifted from the deep straw bedding in the main bay. The Katahdins were a hair sheep breed, hardy, medium-sized animals that shed their coats naturally, required no shearing, and could forage on rough pasture that would starve traditional wool breeds. Nora clicked on the overhead string lights, casting a warm yellow glow across the packed dirt floor. Before unloading a single pumpkin, she walked over to the corner of the feed room, picked up a worn, leather-bound notebook that sat on top of an old metal tool chest, and flipped it open. The notebook had belonged to her grandfather. Its pages were yellowed at the edges, smudged with dried mud, lanolin, and black fountain pen ink. On the page dated November 12, 1974, Thomas Vance had written a single line in his tight, slanted handwriting. "Land on this ridge gives nothing away for free. If you try to force it with bought inputs, it will eat your bank account whole. Work with what the valley discards, and let the stomach of the animal turn trash into soil." Nora stared at the words for a moment, her thumb tracing the frayed edge of the leather cover. She put the notebook down, picked up a chalk line, and marked out 3 distinct zones on the concrete slab of the barn's staging bay. She did not stack the pumpkins in a single massive pile. Stacking meant heat, and heat meant rapid, uncontrollable decomposition. Instead, she sorted them as she unloaded, working slowly under the dim bulbs, her boots making a rhythmic thud against the truck bed. Zone 1, located near the main alleyway, received the pumpkins that were soft-spotted or cracked, but whose interior flesh remained firm, orange, and dense. This was the largest portion, approximately 380 pumpkins. These were the immediate feedstock. Zone 2, set against the dry pine paneling of the west wall, received 60 pumpkins that were structurally intact, showing thick, firm skins with minimal surface mold. These were reserved for seed harvesting, before the frost could penetrate their core. Zone 3, situated near the back compost hatch, took the remaining 160 pumpkins, the ones that were completely collapsed, heavily rotted, or smelling of deep ferment. These were not food for the animals. They were raw biological material for the soil. She worked until 10:15 p.m. When she was finished, her arms ached, her right hand was stiff inside its neoprene brace, and her knee was swollen against the denim of her jeans. But the barn was organized. The mess that Vernon Boyd had considered $40 worth of trash was now an inventory laid out in precise categories. Before turning off the lights, Nora walked into the main sheep bay. The flock stood up quietly, their black eyes reflecting the overhead light. A large 5-year-old ewe with a distinctive white star on her forehead and a quiet, watchful demeanor, the ewe Nora called Lead, walked over to the wooden gate and rested her broad nose against Nora's palm. Nora rubbed the ewe's ears softly with her left hand, feeling the warm, thick skin and the steady, calm breathing of the animal. She did not speak to the ewe. She simply stood there for 2 minutes, assessing the weight on the animal's ribs by sight, before turning off the switch and stepping out into the cold Kentucky night. She went inside her grandfather's kitchen, sat at the wooden table, under a single hanging light bulb, opened her own black ledger, and wrote down her entries for the day. October 28 acquired 600 pumpkins from Route 121 Market, total cost, $20, fuel $4.50, Category 1 feed, 380 units. Category 2 seed, 60 units. Category 3 compost and 60 units. Grain prices at Calloway Feed Co-op today, $4.80 per 50-pound bag, highest in 8 years. Integration begins tomorrow morning at 06 UND. The first frost of November turned into a solid, iron-hard freeze by the end of the second week. At the Calloway Feed Co-op on the south side of Murray, the mood was heavy and quiet. Summer droughts across the Midwest Corn Belt had driven commodity grain prices up for the third consecutive month, pushing the cost of a 50-pound bag of commercial sheep feed to $16.20, an all-time record for the county. Inside the heated office of the co-op, 3 farmers sat on wooden folding chairs around a rusted kerosene heater. Hank Miller stood near the counter, leaning his elbows on the glass display case that held cattle vaccines and leather gloves. Hank said to the store manager, a man named Jesse Vance who was no relation to Nora, "I sold 40 head of steers last Thursday. Couldn't justify keeping them on corn at these rates through February. It's either cull the herd early or let the bank take the land." Jesse nodded, wiping the counter with a greasy rag. "Everyone's cutting back, Hank." Dennis down in New Concord dropped his flock by half. "It's a bad year to be carrying mouths you can't feed." One of the older farmers near the heater looked up and grunted. "What about Thomas Vance's girl up on the ridge? I heard she hauled half a ton of rotted pumpkins home from Boyd's Market last week. Somebody said she was trying to feed rotted jack-o'-lanterns to those hair sheep." Hank Miller let out a short, dismissive grunt. "She loaded 600 moldy carcasses into that old Chevy. I saw her do it, pure ignorance. A person comes out of the army thinking enthusiasm replaces basic livestock management. She'll have 30 dead ewes with bloat before Christmas, and then she'll be down here looking for work." Nobody contradicted Hank. In Calloway County, when a man with 400 acres of bottomland spoke about farm economics, people listened. The consensus was settled. Nora Vance had made an expensive, foolish mistake, and the harsh reality of Oak Ridge would collect its debt before winter was over. 3 miles up the ridge, Nora Vance was not at the feed store. She was standing in the unheated center aisle of her oak barn. At 5:30 in the morning, her work boots dusted with frost, holding a heavy iron cleaver that her grandfather had forged out of an old truck leaf spring in 1978. The wood handle was polished smooth by 40 years of palm sweat, slightly indented to fit the thick base of Thomas Vance's thumb, and now resting comfortably in Nora's left hand. She did not use a mechanical chopper. Machine choppers pulverized pumpkin skin into a slush that lost its nutritional juices and oxidized within hours. Instead, she placed each Category 1 pumpkin onto a oak chopping block, brought the heavy cleaver down with a single controlled strike, and split the fruit into clean quarters. The interior flesh of a pumpkin that is softened on the outside is rarely spoiled throughout. The core remains dense, vibrant orange, packed with natural sugars, beta-carotene, and crude fiber. Her grandfather's ledger had contained a brief note from 1982. Ruminants don't care about a soft skin. They care about the sugar and the seed inside. Introduce slow, balance the fiber, and the gut will adapt in 4 days. Nora followed the protocol with military precision. On the first morning, she brought 40 pounds of split pumpkin into the feeding troughs, replacing just 10% of the sheep's daily grain ration. The Katahdins were cautious at first. Lead, the white-starred ewe, walked up to the wooden trough, sniffed the orange rind, licked a smear of dense orange pulp, and took a small bite. Within 2 minutes, the entire flock of 52 sheep was crowded along the troughs, the sound of rhythmic, steady crunching filling the quiet barn. She monitored them with meticulous discipline. Every 3 days, she walked slowly through the flock, catching each ewe, running her bare left hand along the animal's spine, feeling the fat cover over the ribs, and checking the eye membranes for any sign of digestive distress or anemia. The sheep did not lose condition. Their coats remained bright, their droppings remained firm and well-formed, and their energy levels stayed steady. By the 3rd week of November, Nora had safely replaced 42% of their commercial grain ration with processed pumpkin flesh. Every evening at the kitchen table, she did the math in her notebook. At $6.20 per bag of feed, a 42% grain reduction across 52 sheep over a 100-day winter period represented a direct savings of $1,480. On a 75-acre ridge farm operating on razor-thin margins, $480 was the difference between solvency and collapse. While the sheep ate the Category 1 pumpkins, Nora executed the second phase of her system in the mudroom of her house. She took the 60 structural pumpkins from Category 2, sliced them open, and scraped the dense seed masses into large galvanized tubs. Using wire mesh screens that her grandfather had built for drying apples, she spread the seeds out in single layers across 3 stacked wooden frames set near the mudroom's wood stove. The room smelled of warm pine wood, dry pumpkin skin, and sweet nutty seeds. She had no formal pedigree for the seeds. They were a mixed collection of standard commercial carving varieties, mostly Houghton and Connecticut Field, that Boyd had sourced from local growers. But Nora understood an essential truth that her grandfather had taught her. Seed grown in Calloway County soil knows how to handle Calloway County weather. Catalog seed knows how to grow in the catalog's test garden. She turned the seeds by hand twice a day, cataloging them into small paper feed sacks labeled by weight, moisture level, and date. By early December, she had stored over 24 pounds of high germination pumpkin seed, enough to plant 3 full acres of land, without spending a single dollar at the commercial seed supply. The third part of the operation took place behind the barn, in an area hidden from the road. This was the compost yard, a 3-bay enclosure constructed from heavy oak pallets that Nora had rebuilt during her first summer home. Here, Nora deposited the 160 fully collapsed, rotted pumpkins from Category 3. She did not simply throw them onto a heap. She chopped them coarsely with a spade, layering 6 inches of pumpkin waste with 4 inches of soiled straw bedding and carbon-rich sheep manure cleared from the barn stalls. She was applying the principles of high-temperature aerobic composting that she had studied in Army logistics manuals regarding field sanitation and waste management. Within 4 days, the microorganisms inside the pile began to multiply at a rapid rate. On a freezing Thursday morning in early December, when the outside air temperature stood at 14 Fahrenheit, Nora walked behind the barn, carrying a 3-foot stainless steel compost thermometer. She pushed the probe deep into the center of Bay 2. The dial swept upward and settled precisely at 142 Fahrenheit. Steam rose from the top of the pile in a thick, white column, smelling not of rot but of rich, dark forest floor. The smell of organic matter breaking down into pure biological fertility. That afternoon, a dusty green pickup truck pulled into the farmyard. It was Hank Miller. He had not come to apologize. He had come to return a heavy steel fence stretcher that his brother had borrowed from Thomas Vance 5 years earlier and had forgotten in the back of a hay shed. Hank stepped out of his truck, dragged the fence stretcher out of the bed, and dropped it onto the gravel with a metallic clang. He turned to leave, but stopped when he saw Nora standing near the barn door, wearing her canvas jacket and her leather gloves, a wheelbarrow filled with split pumpkin quarters standing beside her. Hank looked at the wheelbarrow. He looked inside the open barn door, where 52 Katahdin sheep were standing quietly at the troughs, their flanks broad and full, their woolless coats sleek and healthy. Hank shifted his weight, clearing his throat. How are the sheep holding up, Nora? Nora kept her hand on the wheelbarrow handle. They're fine, Hank. Hank stepped closer to the barn door, his sharp eyes scanning the flock. He was a veteran cattleman. He knew how to read an animal's spine and flank from 20 feet away. He could see immediately that these ewes were not starving. They were in prime body condition. Hank looked down at the wheelbarrow. You're actually feeding them those Boyd pumpkins? Nora said, I am. And they're eating it? They eat the flesh, the seeds, and the rind, Nora said, her voice flat and steady. Grain consumption is down 42% since November 1st. No digestive issues, no weight loss. Hank stood silent in the cold driveway for a long moment. His mind was doing the mental math, calculating the cost of corn versus the cost of $20 paid to Vernon Boyd. He looked past Nora into the barn, noticing the neatly stacked trays of drying seed in the mudroom window and the organized bins along the alleyway. Hank said, What are those rotted ones in the back for? The ones that were turned to soup? Nora said, Hot compost. Internal pile temp is 142 degrees right now. It will be finished humus by late February. I'm spreading it on the east slope to build topsoil before spring planting. Hank Miller looked at Nora Vance for a full 10 seconds without speaking. The condescension that had been in his voice at the market lot 6 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by the quiet, guarded attention of a businessman who has just realized he overlooked a critical asset. Hank picked up his gloves, pulled them onto his hands, and gave a single tight nod. Your grandfather was a stubborn man, Nora. But he wasn't dumb. Nora said no, he wasn't. Hank turned and walked back to his truck. He opened the door, paused with his hand on the frame and said, If Boyd has more clearance phantoms in the spring, leave some for the rest of us. Nora looked at him through the cold air. First come, Hank. First served. The second week of January brought the bitterest cold Calloway County had recorded in 22 years. A massive Arctic air mass pushed down from the Canadian plains, locking Oak Ridge in a hard, relentless freeze that dropped nighttime temperatures to 6 degrees below zero. The wind off the northern hills blew without pause for 4 straight days, driving fine snow through the smallest crannies of old wooden outbuildings and coating the country roads in a sheet of solid black ice. Across the valley, industrial farm operations began to buckle under the strain. At Hank Miller's Bottomland cattle farm, 2 automated grain augers froze solid, their electric motors burning out when the thick grease inside the gearboxes hardened into sludge. Farmers who relied entirely on imported commercial pelleted feed found their delivery trucks stuck in snowdrifts along Highway 641. Water pipes burst in uninsulated barns, and cattle lost body condition rapidly as their digestive systems struggled to process dry, low-protein hay in sub-zero weather. On Oak Ridge, Nora Vance rose every morning at 4:30 a.m. She dressed in 3 layers of wool beneath her canvas jacket, wrapped her right wrist tight in its neoprene support, and pulled a heavy thermal cap over her ears. Her right knee clicked sharply in the brutal cold, the old shrapnel ache radiating up into her hip, but her routine did not alter by a single minute. Her winter preparations held firm. In November, while splitting pumpkins, she had spent 3 days insulating the barn's main water line with thick fiberglass wrapping and heating tape, powered by a small, reconditioned generator. While other farmers spent their mornings thawing frozen supply lines with propane torches, Nora's water troughs ran clear and free of ice. Inside the oak barn, the air was cold enough to freeze water in a bucket within an hour, but the insulated sheep bay remained stable and dry. The 52 Katahdin ewes were huddled together on deep beds of dry straw mixed with clean pine shavings. Their broad backs were coated in thick, dense winter coats, their breathing even and slow. Nora walked the troughs twice a day, delivering the carefully measured feed rations. 60% commercial grain supplemented with 40% dense, sugar-rich pumpkin quarters from Category 1. The high moisture content of the pumpkin flesh provided essential hydration, while the natural sugars gave the sheep's rumens the high-energy fuel required to generate internal body heat through the long freezing nights. Not a single ewe fell ill, not a single lamb was lost. On January 18th, during the absolute depth of the cold snap, Nora caught Lee the white-starred ewe, pressed her hand deep into the animal's flank, and felt the thick, firm layer of fat along the ribcage. The sheep was not merely surviving, she was thriving, her weight fully maintained despite the 6 below zero environment. Nora recorded the numbers in her ledger on the kitchen table. while the wind rattled the window panes. January 18, ambient temperature. All 52 head accounted for and in prime body condition. Pumpkin feedstock remaining, approximately 32%. System operating at 100% efficiency. Feed savings to date $1,840. That same morning, Nora put on her heavy boots and walked out to the compost yard behind the barn. The surrounding ground was frozen hard as iron, covered in 4 inches of crusty, windswept snow. She carried her 3-foot stainless steel probe, brushed the snow off the top of Bay 2, and thrust the long metal needle deep into the heart of the pile. The dial reacted immediately, the red needle sweeping upward through 40-80, 100 degrees, finally settling at 118 Fahrenheit. Even in the middle of a sub-zero Arctic freeze, the microscopic life inside the pumpkin and manure mixture continued its work. The high concentration of nitrogen from the decomposed pumpkin flesh, combined with the carbon from the straw and sheep manure, generated enough internal metabolic energy to hold off the freezing air. The pile was cooking itself into rich dark life, while the rest of the county lay dormant beneath ice. By late February, the bitter air finally relented. A series of warm southern breezes drifted up from the Gulf, melting the snowdrifts and softening the top layer of the soil. Nora inspected Bay 2. The heat inside the pile had gradually cooled to ambient air temperature, the definitive sign that decomposition was complete. What had once been 6,000 pounds of soft gray molded cracked pumpkins, discarded at a farm market parking lot, was now 8 cubic yards of dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling organic humus. Nora loaded the finished compost into her wheelbarrow, making 24 trips over 3 days up the steep incline to the east slope. The east slope was a 3-acre stretch of barren, sloping land along the eastern fence line that her grandfather had never been able to cultivate. The topsoil there was barely 2 inches deep, underlain by a dense layer of sticky gray limestone clay that turned into hardpan brick in the summer heat and washed away into gullies during spring rains. It was the worst ground on the entire 75 acres. Nora spread the dark compost evenly across the gray clay, layering it 3 inches thick along the contour lines of the hill. She did not use a tractor or a heavy disc harrow. Heavy machinery on wet clay created deep compaction zones that destroyed soil structure. Instead, she turned 52 Katahdin sheep into the east slope for 4 days. The sheep moved across the slope, their small, sharp, cloven hooves pressing the rich compost deep into the top layer of clay without compacting the subsoil. They deposited their own nitrogen-rich manure as they walked, breaking up the hard clay crust and mixing the organic matter directly into the top 3 inches of earth. In late March, as the spring rains arrived, Nora walked the east slope on foot. She carried a canvas shoulder bag filled with the 24 pounds of dried pumpkin seed she had processed in her mud room, mixed with 50 pounds of crimson clover seed she had purchased at the co-op. Using the steady, rhythmic hand-sowing technique her grandfather had taught her, when she was 12 years old, she broadcast the seed across the worked slope, her feet sinking slightly into soil that felt noticeably softer, darker, and more resilient than it had ever been in her lifetime. She wrote in her notebook that night before bed, March 28, East Slope seeded Category 2 saved seed applied alongside crimson clover. Soil compaction reduced by measurable depth. The trash from Boyd's parking lot is now inside the hill. Now we wait for the sun. By early July, the east slope of Oak Ridge had transformed into something the local farmers had never seen on that barren limestone ridge. The crimson clover had established a dense, nitrogen-fixing understory, and through it, thousands of thick, vibrant green pumpkin vines were spreading rapidly across the 3-acre slope. The broad, dark leaves formed a continuous canopy 6 inches above the ground, locking in soil moisture during the summer heat and choking out the invasive thistles that had dominated the ridge for decades. Beneath the leaf canopy, dozens of broad, pale green fruits were already taking shape. Nora Vance walked the slope on a hot Tuesday afternoon in late August, holding her grandfather's steel soil probe. When she pressed the probe into the gray clay along the fence line, it slid smooth and unresisted to a depth of 10 inches before striking hardpan, compared to just 4 inches the previous autumn. The soil was no longer gray and cracked. It was dark brown, loose and teeming with earthworm activity. In mid-September, she harvested 72 broad, healthy pumpkins from the east slope. It was not a massive commercial crop, but commercial yield had never been the primary goal. The east slope had produced high-quality feed, renewed seed stock, and 3 acres of restored topsoil out of a input that had cost $20 and 4 months of quiet discipline. On a Saturday morning in early October, precisely 1 year after the purchase at the market, a white pickup truck pulled up the gravel driveway of the Vance farm. Vernon Boyd stepped out, accompanied by Mike Tierney, a quiet farmer who managed 200 acres of corn down in the creek bottom. Vernon stood near the barn door, looking out over the east slope. He looked at the clean oak barn, the 52 healthy Katahdin sheep resting in the shade, and the neatly organized bays of the compost yard. Vernon cleared his throat, pulling his hat off his head. "Nora, Hank Miller told me what you did up here with those clearance pumpkins." Nora stood by her truck, her braced right hand resting on the tailgate. "We made use of them, Vernon." Vernon nodded slowly, looking down at his boots. "I've been paying $40 a truckload to haul that stuff to the landfill every November for 16 years. I came up here to tell you, every year from now on, whatever clearance stock I've got at the end of the season, pumpkins, squash, soft corn, you get first call on it, equal to whatever I'd pay the hauler to dump it." Nora looked at him, through the clear autumn light. "I'll take it." Mike Tierney stepped forward, holding a worn notebook of his own. He looked at Nora and said, "I've got 2 acres of wet clay on my west line that hasn't grown anything since 2012. Show me how you layered that compost with the sheep, Nora. I'll pay you for the time." Nora opened the barn door wider, gesturing toward the quiet aisle. "I won't take your money, Mike, but I'll show you the notebook. Pull up a stool." Later that evening, after the visitors had driven back down the ridge, Nora sat alone at her kitchen table. The house was quiet save for the low hum of the wind outside. She opened her grandfather's leather notebook to the final blank page, picked up her pen with her good left hand and wrote, "October 28, Year 1 cycle complete. System established. East slope topsoil depth increased by 6 inches. 52 head wintered without loss. The trash of Route 121 is now the foundation of this farm." She closed the notebook, set it on the shelf beside her grandfather's iron cleaver, and walked out to the barn to check the sheep one last time before dark. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found. Every comment gets read. Everyone.